Hello and welcome to the Let's Talk Azure podcast with your host Sam Foote.
And Alan Armstrong.
If you're new here, we're a pair of Azure and Office 365 focused IT security professionals. Each episode, we talk about a specific topic in this space. This week, it's episode 5 of season 2. We're going to have a chat around compliance management with Azure Policy, Microsoft's tool for tracking and enforcing compliance within Azure. Hey Alan, how are you doing?
Hey Sam, I'm doing okay. Had a couple of days off. So, how are you doing?
Yeah, not too bad. I'm glad we're keeping with our recording schedule and making sure that there's lots of great new content for everyone. So, and I can see that the previous episodes are starting to gain a lot more viewership, not viewership because this is audio only. So listenership, and yeah, we can see that people are really starting to listen. So thanks for everyone for taking the time to listen to us.
Yeah, and I think this new format seems to be working compared to our previous format. Well, I guess we can't really tell because we've had a break. So,
Yeah,
but
exactly. Yeah, yeah, no, it is great. Right, Alan, let's talk around Azure Policy today. So, just to sort of loop everyone in, I'm going to be taking the role, I'll say, of quotes expert. I won't I won't profess to call myself an expert in Azure Policy. I'm sure there's many others out there that are a lot more in depth with Azure Policy. But yeah, we're going to talk around the product. Alan's going to fire some questions at me, and we're just going to talk about how we've used policy in the past, what we like about it, what we don't, and some of the use cases for it.
yep. Okay, so let's get going. So, one question. So, I guess the first question is, in general, is what is regulatory compliance? How do we use it, or why do we need to use it or comply to it?
Okay, so yeah, I think it's good to set the scene of outside of the world of Azure Policy, what goes on in the real world, um, because it might be that people don't maybe realize what certain organizations have to comply to, and when we get approached by customers, they can be of varying different sizes in different industries, and they may be, and the majority of the time, I should say, they follow some sort of regulatory compliance framework. And that could be either because they have decided to adopt that framework. They might not be, they might not be required to adopt a specific framework to base their information management system and their internal, say, quality and control systems on. And others are forced to do that. So they may be in an industry that is regulated, so they may have to follow certain things. I'll give you an example. NIST, the regulatory compliance framework NIST, is required by organizations dealing with the federal government in the United States. So, if they want to, if they want the United States government to procure maybe products and services from them, then they need to adhere to a certain level of the NIST framework. So there's a few really big ones. So you've got NIST, and there's two variants of NIST. You've got CIS, which has many different versions on as they go through the years. They've been changing that. You've got ISO, mainly 27001 for the sort of the IT space. I would say, it's more it's mostly used for. Then you've got things like PCI compliance. So that's all around if you store and process credit card information. The credit and debit card industry have their own level of PCI compliance for managing, because you can imagine what it's like to capture all of the details of somebody's bank card, and the controls that need to go in place of that, and making sure that that's secure. Because even if you're transmitting them over a secure wire, um, they've still got to land somewhere, and you may need to hold those for a certain amount of time before you say capture the information. And then let's say you're going to do a refund, you might need those details to process that refund as well. So you'll have these organizations that follow these regulatory compliance frameworks, and and effectively, then what happens is they have to apply them to their IT estate. So I'll give you the example. I'll just use PCI again. I'm a business that handles credit card information, so I must follow PCI compliance, which invariably then, as part of that framework, it gives us controls and policies of the best practice approach to mitigating the risk of like say a security breach. So if I'll give a working example. It may say that a regulatory compliance framework may say that all data at rest must be encrypted to a certain level. And so the regulatory compliance framework is telling the organization that, and then they have to then go and make sure that their whole IT estate that is handling that information at least it follows that policy and actually enforces it throughout their organization.
So, so are we saying that some of these compliances or regulatory compliances have technical controls, you know, for the from the IT space, but also there's a lot of process as well, business process that they have to comply to as well.
Yeah. Usually in an organization, there's sort of two sides to this. There's the business process side and policies, procedures, and controls that they have from a like an information management perspective. If you're talking about say ISO, so you'll have all of the controls that are related to what they should do in the event of X and Y. And then the other side of that is and almost the more granular and specific information around the technical compliance side. Because just because let's use the example that I used before of like storing rest based um rest based having rest based encryption on all of your systems for storage. Well, that's no use if your access control policy to your front door of your office allows anybody to walk in and plug, a USB stick into the front of a server. And I've really massively generalized that, but there are real world considerations that you have to take into account, not just the pure technical scenario, right? That was a really sort of noddy example of mine, to be honest with you. And I only really get involved in the technical compliance side. And what we are seeing now is a lot of organizations who maybe have, they might have regulatory compliance teams within their organization. But what you'll generally tend to find is those people aren't technically skilled, or from a IT perspective. So it requires, maybe technical input from people that maybe aren't regulatory compliance experts, say like me and you, Alan, to help people that actually manage these frameworks within the organization to achieve the results that they want. So I think it's like there's basically two sides. There are two sides to it, definitely.
Yeah. Okay. So what? So how does Azure Policy? What is Azure Policy? How does it help me? I guess in some sense help me meet a regulatory compliance.
Okay, so I think to start off with, to preface, is that if you Azure Policy, obviously Azure understands the resources that you have deployed within Azure, right? They handle the management and the deployment and the maintenance of the virtual resources that you've got. And what Azure Policy is doing, it's effectively an umbrella on top of. It can be scoped down, but let's just talk in general sense. It's sort of an umbrella above all of your resources. And what it can do is you can apply a number of policies. So to give you an idea of a policy, and a policy may be, to require Azure Disk Encryption. Let's use that as an example. It's a little bit of an awkward example as well, so I'll keep using it throughout this. So, um, so you could have a policy which says all of my virtual machines, and everything that's connected to them must be covered by Azure Disk Encryption, which effectively is BitLocker, right, in the Windows world. So you could put a policy in place which you put that singular policy in place, and it could go off and look at all of your virtual machines and say which ones have got Azure Disk Encryption enabled on it or not. Now, from a discovery perspective, that's very powerful, because if those policies are then linked back to regulatory framework policies, then you can start to understand whether you're compliant in certain controls for those regulatory compliance frameworks. So if PCI required Azure Disk Encryption or some level of encryption, on those machines, then you could say, okay, for this control inside of this regulatory compliance framework, then I can see all of my resources and I can see which ones are compliant and which ones aren't. That gives me a really good indication of, for that control inside of a regulatory compliance framework, whether I'm actually meeting that control or not. And I don't think I really talked about controls too much, actually, so I'll just jump back to that because I think I skipped over that in terms of regulatory compliance. Regulatory compliance frameworks will have a number of controls. They'll be numbered like, section 1.1.1, dot 1.2, and vice versa. They group them together in certain controls, and those are the controls. And those are the controls, aka the policies that are in place that they want to enforce inside of your organization. So, as I said before, a control might be that all data is stored at rest, with encryption placed on it. That's a very common one nowadays for regulatory compliance regulatory compliance frameworks. So we can map, Azure Policy is able to map controls that are from regulatory compliance frameworks to actual policies inside of Azure.
Okay, so are you saying then that we're talking about Azure? So is there some templates, policy definitions based on those regulatory compliances, so that you've got the controls that you can use on Azure sort of mapped out, so you can see, in effect, what compliance you are against a regulatory compliance?
Okay, so in answer to your question, yes. Azure Policy has what they term to be policy initiatives, and a policy initiative is effectively a group of policies that you can apply at certain scopes inside of your Azure environment. So what you can do, if you're lucky enough to follow a regulatory compliance framework that they have already created an initiative for in Azure, then it is relatively simplistic to get that level of visibility. Okay, because what you can do is you could say, we'll take CIS 1.3. So there's a policy initiative for CIS 1.3. And what you can do is, it's already pre-packaged for you in Azure. You simply assign it at whatever scope that you want. You either assign it at a management group scope, a subscription scope, and then you can go on from there. So what you could say is if I want just visibility of that to start off with, because usually when a customer comes to us, they might not have any Azure policy in place whatsoever. They might not have any knowledge about how compliant they actually are, right? So usually the first part of that engagement is to put an initiative in place that is in audit only, right? And each of the policies that we put in place in Azure Policy, we've got different modes that they can be put in. And I'll talk about those a little bit later, because we can talk about that for a long time. But effectively, what I could do is I could say, okay, I follow CIS 1.3. I want to roll out an initiative that is audit only to start off with. I apply it, and then I wait a few hours, let's say, right?
Mhm.
Because everything, it runs on, say, like timer jobs. It's not instant, right? You have to wait for things to refresh. Different assets and different systems refresh at different times. So effectively, we set it and then come back tomorrow, right? Like that's how we sort of think about it. And then there's probably a specific refresh time, right? But we just flick it and wait. And then what we can do is come back the next day, and then we can go, okay, for my policy, my policy initiative of CIS 1.3, I'm going to go into that one, and I'll be able to see all of the controls that it's mapped to. It won't be able to map to all of the controls inside the regulatory compliance framework because some of them aren't applicable to Azure and they're not applicable to the technology that we're handling. They might be business process and bits and bobs like that. There might also just be controls that can't be checked automatically in Azure, which need to be, those gaps need to be filled in. That's where, humans will then take over and help with this. Um, and then you'll be able to drill down. You'll be able to say, okay, inside of encryption, I can see that 4 of my 20 VMs don't have Azure Disk Encryption enabled. Okay, I will then know that I need to start remediating them. I can put a remediation plan in with my, say, infrastructure team to start working on those problems. So a policy initiative can be a very, very quick way to get a view of regulatory compliance in, so you can start remediating. One big caveat to that is a lot of there are a lot of things that are not covered by these policy initiatives and even policy in itself that can't be tested. So I think it's good to understand that Azure policy and policy initiatives are one part of a larger, regulatory compliance framework and process inside of your business. It can massively help and give you visibility, but it's not a case of just enabling an initiative and then you've seen everything that is wrong. There are potentially hundreds of other areas that need to be manually looked at.
Okay, so as well, I guess that these policies are to help you discover what you as an organization has control of. Because if we think about the um, who has responsibility in a cloud environment, depending on if it's a virtual machine, then you have to take more responsibility about the operating system, things like that. Where if you've got a web app service or something like that, that there's less for you to look after. So I'm guessing there is some documentation that says what Azure in general complies against, isn't there? I think so that
Yeah.
you know that at least the back end, the core stuff, or any of the services are covered under certain regulatory compliance until it's the organization's responsibility.
Yeah, and I think what Azure Policy is going to do is show you where your shared responsibility model with your cloud provider, because that's how they all work, is on shared responsibility models, right? That yes, we will give you, if we give you a virtual machine, that isn't inherently secure. Microsoft can come in and be compliant to certain regulatory standards, but what you do on that virtual machine could lead it to be insecure, right? And what policy is also helping you with is saying, hey, I think hey, we think you should change this, because invariably what can happen sometimes is you could deploy something, it be compliant, and then after a certain amount of time it could become uncompliant, right? Just because of general, a workload's deployed to it, somebody's jumped in and accidentally added the wrong firewall rule or something like that, right? That's what we're a lot of that low hanging fruit is what we're trying to identify with these
Yeah.
policies, and in a way that we can clean up after other people, if that makes sense. Because what we also have the talking about, I suppose this comes back to shared responsibility. um what we can sometimes have is we can have like a customer with a product team. Let's say they're a SaaS business and they're building software over and over again. They've got their roadmap that they're just building against, and they're like, smash forward. I've got to get through my roadmap. I've got to keep my investors happy. I've got to keep, my shareholders happy. Um, and then maybe they invariably miss a few things because they're running it, 1,000 miles an hour, and Azure Policy can also help with that because it can be sort of a big brother looking over your shoulder and going, "Hey, that storage account you just created? Well, anybody can access it from anywhere, right? And it's got public blobs in it, right? So, and a lot of the time, those vulnerabilities are shown just from just human mistake. It's not necessarily somebody's like hacked into Azure storage accounts and then got access to it. It's most of the time it's humans leaving things open and vulnerable to attack.
Yeah. So can you? Is there a way to stop deployments automatically being non-compliant against a regulatory compliance? Can you stop someone deploying it? I guess in that
Okay, so
config.
let's talk about remediation because it all sort of fits inside of
Yeah.
this area. So I mentioned it briefly earlier, but when you either create or there are inbuilt policies inside of Azure, when you use those policies, some of those policies have the ability to have what's called deny effects on them. So what you could say is, let's think of one that is really simple. Um, storage accounts. So storage accounts, networking rules inside of a storage account inside of Azure. So what you can say is you can do an enforcement and say, you know, um, all storage accounts. Let's say in your business you didn't need any public storage accounts. Bit weird, but it can happen. Like, actually, to be fair, it's not that weird actually, right? So so you basically say, um, you basically say, right, I don't want to create any storage accounts that have public blob access, right? You can create a policy which audits that and says, which one of my storage accounts has actually got that issue. But better than that, you could put a deny in effect in there, a deny effect in there, which says don't allow anybody to create a storage account that has public blob access. Now, what you're then doing is then you're preventing, regulatory compliance issues in the future. And you're also saving yourself a job because you don't have to remediate a live production system, in the future, which can be very complicated and very hard to get across the line. So yes, you can definitely do that. Now, to caveat that, because that sounds quite exciting, because it's just like, what I'll do? I'll bind my whole, I'll create this create this policy initiative that just covers everything, and nobody can do anything wrong, right? Like I'm going to control everything with policy. It's not quite that simple because some of some of the regulatory compliance policies um, cannot be cannot be enforced at the time that resources are created. I'll loop back to my Azure Disk Encryption example. You can't utilize Azure Disk Encryption until there is an operating system, because, say, for Windows, it uses BitLocker. Now, you can't enforce that until the actual machine is live in there. So it's like a post deployment step. You build your machine, your operating system is then loaded onto it, and then you can BitLocker it down. So so there's a time delay with that. So you can so for Azure Disk Encryption, you can report to the business when a new virtual machine is created that doesn't have Azure Disk Encryption, but you cannot enforce it at the time it is created. Now, that's just one example of it, but you are going to invariably run into scenarios where you might have in CIS. I think there's 103 policies. I think it's something like that. It's over 100. I can't remember the exact number, but you've got 103, and you might only be able to enforce, say, 10 of those policies, right? Because and also you have to take each of those policies in the context of which it is used. So I use the example of public blobs. So you have to think about, okay, 99% of my storage accounts should not be public, but maybe I've got a marketing folder that I attach images for my marketing emails that get sent out to general public. I need that one to be able to be publicly accessible. So just enforcing something at scale like that might work, if you're wanting to, lock everything down. But sometimes we find that it's just better to report on things and then just to do either an exception or a remediation, a manual remediation after it.
Yeah, I was going to say there's probably some scenarios where configuration, whilst it makes sense, everyone understands why you want to do it, but in like you said, the public storage counts, some scenarios there's a legitimate reason why the business needs it to be configured that way, and I think you kind of organizations need to take the approach of everything, whilst everything should be compliant to one of these regulatory compliances, etc. But in reality, some of it is just so locked down. It's no point having services. So you have to take that exception where it makes sense, and it's all about documenting it
Yep.
and identifying the
Yeah.
risk and things like that.
Yeah, and risk is the exact keyword that you mentioned there, right? Is it's always calculated risk. Because I'll give you an example. Um, some regulatory compliance frameworks require you to have DDoS, anti-DDoS protection, inside on any virtual networks that have, you know, um, uh, uh, public IPs, right? So if you have a virtual machine that is public facing, some regulatory compliance frameworks require you to have anti DDoS in front of it. And do you know how much anti DDoS costs in Azure? It's expensive. It's thousands of pounds, euros, dollars, however you pay for things. It's very, very, very expensive. So what policy can also do is it can help you to understand, actually, should we not go for an IaaS setup with that? Should we go for a PaaS setup because Microsoft's playing for anti DDoS, on their PaaS side instead? So when people think, okay, paying extra for PaaS is costing me money, and I'm not getting as many virtual CPU core cycles, and it's not as it's not as cost efficient for me to do that. They sometimes forget all of the extra things that they're getting on top that they don't have to ever worry about or manage, right? So, but it does really come down to, because every regulatory compliance framework is different. So it's really understanding your regulatory compliance framework for your organization and how your business is actually, mitigating, well, implementing that framework inside of their business. You know, we've seen organizations that have all of the business process side and all the documentation and not very much on the technical side, and also the other way around, right? So it's not just a case of us technical people, because this is just technical, the technical side of it. It requires the whole business to be part of
Yeah, and just quickly, in a previous couple of jobs, two or three, used to work for a local authority, and we had strict compliances to meet against, but some of the configurations for this. So this is not talking about cloud, but this is just talking about Windows devices. Some of it was disable these features, which meant that some of the core apps wouldn't work. So we had to take that exception and, I guess, mitigate the risk. So determine what departments needed that. So it's all about in fact, it's exactly what I said. Identifying the risk and working out what mitigations you're going to put in place to reduce that risk
it.
or
Exactly.
manage that risk.
Yeah. Yeah, and
So
I don't think I don't think some people realize how much work that is,
hmm.
right? To to solution architect something in Azure, and then also to make sure that it's regulatory compliant to your customers' frameworks. It's never ever happened to me, but I've seen it in the past where a a solution has gone in, somebody's completely forgot to ask the question of what regulatory compliance framework are we working against, and then bang, it gets deployed, and and invariably remediation then needs to happen, or very expensive remediation needs to happen, right? Because it's not necessarily about remediation in Azure, because that can sometimes be relatively easy to do, like checking a box or changing something. But when you're then saying, okay, you've now got to take anti DDoS protection on that virtual machine that I made for you, stomaching. I think it's 2,000. Is it 3,000 euros a month? I can't remember what it is, but it's something like that. And you could get to that stage too far down the line, which is why I think cloud security professionals need to have it front and center, and need to understand policy, because it's relatively simple as you're creating that architecture, and we'll talk about Terraform and deploying it as code in a bit. But it's relatively simple to have that running whilst you're building your solutions, and then understanding where those gaps are ahead of time.
Yeah. Okay. So yeah. So I guess you're saying around, if you had your staging environment, you can put it on there and determine what it is before it goes to production,
Exactly.
etc. So
Yeah.
look at me. I'm talking about app development there. Um, okay.
Solution architecture,
Yes. Solution
but
architect.
yeah,
Right.
I
Right.
know what you mean though. I know what you
Right.
mean.
No dev background at all, apart from logic apps. Um, anyway, so we've talked about Azure Policy and how it can help with regulatory compliance within Azure. At least, is there anything else it can do? Is there anything else it can help with? Is there anything around governance or management of the Azure environment that it can do for us?
One, I suppose the biggest part for me is around tag governance. Okay, and I think tagging. I mean, we could do a whole episode on tagging. It might not be very exciting, but I think it could be quite useful, because I think tagging is relatively overlooked in terms of how its importance, right? Because the organization, and I don't really want to talk about tagging specifically, but the organization of resources inside of Azure has to be more than just logical placing of things inside of subscriptions and resource groups. You need more than just that metadata to accurately, and it's more of a problem at scale, right? So once you've got thousands of resources, trying to work out like who owns the resource, maybe not the person that put it in or deployed it, but who is the current owner of that. And I'm not talking from a RBAC perspective. I'm talking about, if this system breaks, Alan is the guy that I need to talk to, right? And that's his fundamental. And then when Alan leaves, how do we then pass the flag over, the baton over to the new owner, and things like that. So structuring tags and tagging is a whole other episode, but one thing to understand is Azure Policy can enforce that certain tags are required on resources. And what's great about it is that it can also flow down tags from, say, subscriptions down to resource groups. So into resources, sorry, and resource groups. Actually, that is correct. So I'll give you an example. So you might have your management groups and subscriptions set up where you have, say, a management group for a specific area in your business, and then you have a dev and a prod subscription. That might be the way you do it. I'm just using an example off the top of my head. So you've got System A, and you've got dev and prod subscriptions underneath that management group. And lots of people have their management groups and subscriptions set up in different ways depending on their that's a whole other 5 episodes in itself, right?
Landing
So
zones, yep.
landing zones, yeah, cloud, yeah. Anyway, let's pretend that all
Yeah.
that stuff doesn't exist at the moment. But in my simple example, what you might want to say is, you might want to say, inside of that dev subscription, my dev environment, I want all the resources in there tagged automatically with environment is equal to dev. Because then you definitely know that everything inside of there is inside of a development subscription. When you're 3 levels deep in blades in the portal, you'll always be able to see that there's a tag at the top which says it's dev or prod and things like that. It's not really used for that, because it's used for more like large scale querying and scanning. You can infer a lot of this information from just using resource graph explorer and writing some crazy queries to find certain things, but it is an absolute godsend when you can say, list me all of the resources that have the owner Alan Armstrong, right? Because because when you do that, it can span across all categories. And then you can say, okay, show me only production environments that Alan Armstrong is the quotes owner of, things like that. So when it's a relatively small estate, that's not really that helpful because, you've got your logical grouping anyway. You could just move around and find stuff out. But when you've got potentially hundreds of subscriptions and thousands of resource groups, trust me when I say you'll spend hours, if not days, trying to find who owns things, and especially when assets have been deployed over 90 days ago, like, good luck. Like, so yeah, and when you're talking about big businesses, that is a real problem for them. So policy can enforce that for you. So you could say every time you create a subscription has to be flagged with an environment, let's say. So it has to be dev. So when you create the subscription, it's got to be on there. Or if you can't enforce it at the time, you could audit it to make sure that they're actually on there. Then you could create another policy to say every resource that is inside of every resource group that's inside of that subscription, inherit that tag down if it's there. So then you get them down to your resource groups. Then you could create a policy to say inherit the environment tag all the way from resource groups down to your resources, if that makes sense. So what you can do is you can do some really good tag governance with really low overhead of actually managing the tags. Like, I know of a customer who has, say, 5 tags at the subscription level, 1 required tag at the resource group level, and then all of their resources are tagged automatically. Now, and we're talking hundreds of resources or thousands of resources, hundreds of resource groups. Do you know what I mean? Like, they are absolutely massive. So you can get really good tag governance with very little overhead. Imagine having to manually manage all of that, like, over time. Impossible. Absolutely impossible.
Yeah, I was just about to say, is there a way of, I guess, inheriting them, or does it cause a lot of overhead? But like you just said, depending on how you deploy it or configure it, and what tags you need, of course, as well, you can automatically do a lot of that if it's set higher up. Obviously, at some point, if there's a new subscription, if you're doing it at that level, then there's an initial configuration, but outside of that, then it,
Exactly.
it
Yeah. Yeah.
inherits.
And every organization is going to approach its tag governance, its tagging strategy, in a different way, right? And invariably, sometimes policy won't be the right tool for that job. But if you're following, say, cloud adoption framework in bits and bobs like that, and you're generally just saying, okay, we're going to follow best practice advice from Microsoft, a lot of those scenarios are already kind of catered for in policy, for you. So it's not, because tags are always the bane if you got them manually, like, but I'm
Yeah.
saying, no, let's be lazy. Let's just set it once and inherit it down. As long as our management group structure and our subscription structure is how we want it to be. And some businesses aren't at that point, right? Because everything's just in a single subscription, just dumped in there, and it's a bit horrible. So sometimes you can't do it. But, if people that have actually gone through that process of changing that, it does work really well.
Okay. So we talked about tagging. Is there anything else that it can do? I think there's one around resource location and things like that, isn't there?
Yeah, so when we talk to customers about cloud standardization, we one of the great areas is locking down resource locations. It's a relatively simple thing to do, and I think I feel it's really effective. So if you have a data sovereignty regulation, let's say you've got a regulatory compliance control, which means that you have to keep data within the EU, let's say. What we can do is we can put a policy in place that when a resource is deployed, we lock down where it can actually be deployed to. So what we could then say is we could then pick a list of Azure locations. So you might say that I only want people to be able to deploy in UK South and UK
West.
West. Yeah, sorry, I was thinking East. I don't know why, but my brain was like backwards then. So you might say, okay, I only want, in our example, I don't want any of my data to reside outside of the UK. So I'm happy for any resource to be created in UK South, and UK West, but I don't want them anywhere else. You know, and that is really powerful because it stops accidental hiccups of data being stored in the wrong place. Because somebody could, and we've been there before, haven't we, Alan? When you go to create a resource and it just randomly picks um, a subscription and a resource group and a location for you, right?
Yes.
And I say random. There must be. We need to find out from somebody if there's actually any logic to that. But yeah, so you can, you can accidentally deploy to the wrong location, and that might not be thought about for months. A production system might go live, and then it's not until somebody's actually come in and actually checked it and gone, you know what, you're storing sensitive PII information in America, which you don't have. It's not in your privacy agreement, with your data subjects that you can actually do that. And then you're like, oh, now I've got to move it, right? So it can have big knock-on effects, and that's why I love, especially that one. And I should have brought that up. That's probably actually my favorite of the tagging, to be totally honest with you. It's so trivial to put in. It's an inbuilt control policy, and it's just great. Like, and it just, why not put it in and then never have to remediate that problem ever again, right? Just get rid of it, or don't put it in, and then you could pay people like, Alan and I to come and fix it for you. But you don't want to do that, right? So just put this policy in place, and then be enforced, forever, basically.
Yeah, it's definitely really powerful, and I think
Resource
there's quite a few
restrictions in
others there that
certain
are built
regions and
in.
things like that,
One of
right?
them,
So
I can
you,
think
you
of
can
is that you
only
can
be
limit which
you can only
VMs you
like
spin up, so you can
you can
make sure
only
that there's
have
no some
like an
GPU
allowance of
ones.
single
Yeah, so
digit
you're
GPU
not racking up
instances, right? And
the
it's like,
cost, things
do
like
you
that.
want people just to be able to, not just the cost, but also the actual, limiting of the actual resources as well, right? So yeah, it's there's many other built-in bits, yeah, and yeah, if this wasn't audio, I'd love to go in and show some specifics, right? Because there are some really good inbuilt ones,
Hmm.
but I think it's better just to keep it high level and get people to go and have a look at it.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, so there's a few ways to approach this.
Yeah.
We've got ARM templates built into Azure. So you can create ARM templates with your policies in
Yeah.
place,
Okay.
deploy
So
them via
we kind of talked about this
a very simple
earlier a little
pipeline,
bit, or
which
started
effectively
to.
will just
You know,
fire
do I have to use the
Azure
portal?
CLI
Can
um,
we deploy by
to
code?
deploy them.
You
What I like about, and there's Terraform, which can also do it as well, and then there's Blueprints as well, which is a way to bundle many different types of resources together. So if you're doing more than just policy, then you can bundle other things. So if you're if you want to deploy specific resource groups to every new subscription, that you can do that in a blueprint and things like that, which is really powerful. But what's great about not doing it via the um, the interface is that you can create your own custom policy initiative and then bundle in like extra things. So what we'll invariably end up doing is taking CIS and all the built-in controls for that, and then adding a bunch of cloud standardization stuff to it as well. There's also nothing stopping you deploying those separately and having multiple initiatives, but I personally prefer to like lump them together, and have it all as one like thing, one object. And if you do all of your configuration in code and deploy it, then you can also have a really good change management process, right? It's not just a case of going in the portal and updating a few things. It's actually, there's a process of actually changing that, it going through a review and then being deployed. So, and some people completely block people from changing any policy and only allowing the code policies, the code initiative, the code-based initiatives to actually roll out. So there's many different control elements that you can do there, because it depends in your organization how RBAC works, and that's another conversation, right? This isn't us, doing some sort of discovery, but there's usually always somebody that can come in and change anything at any given time. There is an activity log and an all, so you can understand what people have done. But sometimes it's better to just have everything grayed out and go, hey everyone, these are the rules. If you don't like it, talk to this team and they'll roll out a change for you. So yes, 100% policy as code, deploying from GitHub, Azure DevOps, GitLab, like however you fancy doing that. And from my personal perspective, that's the exact way that I try to approach it with a customer. If they have those things set up, if they have DevOps and everything ready to go, or help them put that in at that time. Yeah. Yeah. And if you're lucky enough to have a product
Yeah.
team,
Okay.
development
Cool.
team,
I guess
product team,
whilst we
well,
say about
it's
change
interesting because
management, I
in
guess as
certain
part of
companies,
that,
different people look
if it
after the
was
infrastructure of the product. So
managed by a
let's in this
security team to
scenario
do
pretend that the dev team
the
also
locking
does the
down of the
infrastructure,
environment,
and there's a
those
security
reviews
team
could be
that
done
sort of
by the
comes in and cleans
dev
up after
teams
them,
to make
if that
sure
makes
it's not going to
sense,
break
right?
their app,
If
things
you're
like that,
lucky
or
enough
force the
that
pipeline to
your
go via the different
development
stages,
team
etc.
or your infrastructure team uses Terraform, then you can run regulatory compliance checks against Terraform before it even goes live. So there is
Hmm.
also, it's not Azure Policy, it's before that point. It's part of the Terraform toolchain, but you can effectively say, okay, check my Terraform files for CIS 1.3, and if it's not compliant, then throw a big red error message in DevOps pipelines, and don't let it go into production. So there's another reason. There's all roads lead back to Terraform. Let's be honest about it for us Azure guys. But there's many reasons to have infrastructure as code, because this does feed into it as well.
Okay,
Yeah, so you
so
can
something
connect
becomes, if we go back
Event Grid
to
to Azure
things not
Policy,
being compliant,
and what
that
that will do is,
a-
as the
apart from
compliance
me
status of
going
resources
into the Azure
changes,
policy and
it
seeing
can
that something's
fire
not
events
compliant,
into Event Grid,
is
and
there a
then
way
from there
for
you can pretty much
Azure
do
policy or
whatever you
Azure
want
to
with it.
tell me that something's gone into
So
a
that is
non-compliant state,
their
or I guess the other way that
sort
something's
of
become compliant?
main viewpoint of how that the communication element and the alerting element of that should happen. So what's sometimes quite nice is to pump those alerts, say, into a Teams channel as things update. Um, X, Y, and Z has now become uncompliant, or and showing that back to the organization. Because, like you say, you could just configure all this stuff, especially if you're just doing it in audit mode, and then leave it forever, and just nobody ever look at it ever again, and that's not particularly helpful for anyone, right? So, yeah, yep, yep,
Yeah, I guess a from that perspective, if you're not going to enforce sort
D-
of
a defender for
being
cloud
informed
is
proactively,
a really
that's what we're talking
interesting,
about,
and
proactively
when
being
have we
informed
done an
that
episode
something's
on defender
changed.
for cloud?
Um,
We did security
I
center,
guess
didn't we?
that you can see some of that regulatory compliance within the Defender for Cloud product. So you can see it maybe in a
Yeah, okay,
nicer
fine.
view than maybe Azure
Okay,
policy in some
okay.
sense,
Because
but
I think
yeah,
that
being
that's a very
notified in
good.
Teams or Slack or
That I
whatever.
think we should revisit regulatory compliance in Defender for Cloud, because there is a there is some overlap there. I think,
So
right?
in the last
And I
season,
think
yeah, in
what
the last season we did
the
Security Center,
TLDR of
Defender for
that
Cloud's
is that
imminent.
Defender for
Maybe not
Cloud
next
can
week,
give you
but maybe
really
the
good
week or a couple of weeks
visibility,
after. But
but on from that, it doesn't have the functionality to enforce and to do maybe some of the other bits
mhm,
that Azure Policy does really well, right? But like you say, there's a lot of things coming into, especially into Defender for Cloud, that are really helping with that communication piece, single pane of glass, being able to look at multiple tenants and things like that, right? Because there's lots of things going on there. So what we generally the way that I generally think about this is, if you're a company, if you're an organization that has adopted Defender for Cloud, because there is an inherent cost of that, as well, not just in terms of time, but the actual cost of it, because it
yeah,
can be quite expensive, not quite expensive, but it can rack up, right? So you've got to make that decision about whether you're going to pay for that. Um, so if you are a Defender for Cloud enabled organization, and I'm not saying you shouldn't be, but there's a decision to make there. Um, then you can get really good visibility of regulatory compliance, relatively easily with Defender for Cloud, can't you? But it's when some of the exception handling and things like that, Azure Policy can really help you, and the enforcement, I think, is the big part that is missing from that side. That's right? Is now I don't think you can. Yeah, we gotta talk about it. Yeah, but I haven't said anything that's incorrect there, have I? Like, just for this one, or yeah, exactly. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
yeah.
I'm not
I
the
think
defender for,
we'll leave
well,
it
the
to an episode because
defenders
we could talk about it a
expert.
lot.
That's for sure,
We're
right? That's in Alan's wheelhouse for sure. So yeah,
no,
let's
no.
let's talk about
There's some
regulatory
things that
compliance, and we'll do a
because we've been
cross
living
back
in it the last
into
12 months, haven't we?
Azure
So
Policy and
that's
how
why
they
it's quite a good
relate
place
to
to
each other,
sort
because
of go
we
into
have been
later
asked
on.
that
But
before, haven't we? Like,
yeah, I think most of it's
why
right.
would I use
Again,
audit mode in Azure
we'll
Policy
try
when
and
I've
cover
just
it
got
all.
Defender for Cloud? Well, you know, yeah. So and things like that. So yeah, we can talk about that.
Yeah, yeah.
That's correct.
Okay, so I think now we're kind of coming to the end. So I think we're looking at a recap. So, in their industry, they have to comply against some of them, like NIST, as we talked about in CIS. Um, Azure Policy allows you to audit and potentially control um, deployments or functionality or configuration within Azure, which could help towards compliance or could help with other outside of compliance, other things like the tagging, the where you deploy your resources to. Um, it can be managed and deployed via code. There's some Terraform tooling that can help you with your CS compliance before you send your code up there for infrastructure at least.
Yeah.
Um, you
Yeah,
can
I think just one
track,
thing
you can
about
get it
automatic
to proactively
remediation, I
tell
think
you
I
when
just
something
didn't
becomes
touch on,
non-compliant or
is it is
compliant
possible to
based
create a
on events
remediation
happening.
task to
Um,
remediate things in
Everything else
bulk,
you can do
if
automatic
that makes
remediation.
sense.
Yeah, it's
So
kind of the things we were talking
you,
about where you
for
can
instance, with
enforce
the
it.
tag,
Is there anything
the
else I've
tagging, you
missed?
can run a remediation tag to flow down all your a remediation task to flow down all your tags, after the fact. Now, we can sometimes do that if the change is relatively mundane. Like, let's say you want to disable FTP and FTPS on your app services. It might be that you only have a handful of them, and it's relatively known that nobody connects with FTP. So fine, we'll remediate to go back to no access, and then we'll enforce it going forward that nobody else can create them, that can use that feature or functionality, right? So it is possible to do that, as well. Okay, great. Well, let's leave it there for this episode. And if you've been listening, thank you ever so much for listening. It's been yeah, it's been a good one, hasn't it? What is the next episode, Alan? I believe
Okay,
it's you
cool.
next time, so you got to pick which one you want to talk about.
S- Well, we normally talk about our
Okay.
feedback, and I haven't spoke to you
Yep.
about this yet, but should we see if people will
Okay.
give us some feedback about what the next episode should be around, should we do Defender for Cloud
Yeah. Exactly.
or
Yep. Yep.
Microsoft Entra Azure AD? Shall we see if we get some feedback on it? If we don't, we'll choose one of them. I think it will probably be Azure
And how
AD.
can people give us
But
feedback, Alan?
if we want to sort of continue with this regulatory compliance, then we can switch to Defender for Cloud. So if we get some feedback, we can work on that, and we can see if we get some feedback. That'd be cool.
Okay. Great.
So within the show notes underneath this episode, there is a link, and it will take you to a form, and you can fill out there, and it will send us some feedback into our uh, deployment or management of our podcast. So yeah, and it doesn't just have to be about what we're trialing this. What the next episode is going to be. It could be was this a good episode? Did we miss something? Is there something else you want us to elaborate on that maybe actually you found this really interesting? You know,
Yeah.
we need to understand
Exactly.
if we're
Yeah.
doing the right things,
And
because
and
we're
yeah,
kind of not
as
guessing. We've
Alan
got some
mentioned,
ideas about what episodes
I
in the future
think
are going to be,
what
but
is great to see
they're easily
is
changed
the
to meet
engagement that we're
what our
getting on these
readers,
episodes.
listeners
So if you do like
um,
the content that we're
want to
covering,
hear.
then
So
please do considering giving us a subscribe in your podcast clients. And yeah, if you do have any feedback, even critical, please do share it with us. We'd prefer to talk about the things that everybody wants to listen to instead of the things that we want to come on and blab about, right? So please don't be shy from that perspective. So yeah, so next time we're gonna either do Defender for Cloud or Azure AD. And yeah, it, no feedback. We'll just do whatever we decide to do. But yeah, but thanks everyone for listening, and we'll catch you in the next one. Cheers. Thank you. Bye bye.
yeah, thanks everyone. See you later.